Right.
Okay, today's daf is going to be Chaftet. We left off on Chaftet, Amud Aleph. We left off approximately 1, 2, 3 lines from the top, where it says Rava Amar. Now, what we're discussing is what is the machloket between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva in the Mishnah. They had a machloket about a wick that is rolled up but isn't singed. So the first interpretation of the machloket was that it had to do with breaking the kli, with breaking the vessel, with whether if this is a vessel that's exactly the measurement of 3 by 3. It's exactly the measurement that's considered a vessel that could be mikabel tum'ah. We're talking about like a piece of linen, which is 3 by 3 finger breadths. And by burning it, you're going to be diminishing the size, and therefore you're going to be dealing with shivrei kelim. You're going to be dealing with a broken vessel. So that's a problem on a Yom Tov that is on a Friday. That's the way that we interpreted it in the first approach. So now Rava says Hainu Ta'amad Rabbi Eliezer, a different approach. This is exactly what we read about in the halacha this morning. That according to Rabbi Eliezer, you're not allowed to use a wick that hasn't been singed. It has nothing to do with the fact that by lighting this wick, you're going to be diminishing its size, and therefore you're going to be dealing with a broken vessel, and therefore this halacha only applies on a Friday that's also a Yom Tov. We're not saying that. We're saying that in all cases, you're not allowed to use a wick that's unsinged, and you're not allowed to use rags that are unsinged. In other words, anything that you're going to use has to be singed first, so that it will hold the fire well, and Rabbi Akiva disagrees with that. That's how we interpret our Mishnah. So that then we have a different problem, which is that Rav Yosef came in before and said, now I understand what I was taught, that we're talking about 3 etzba'ot by 3 etzba'ot, that it was a reference to this Mishnah, that 3 etzba'ot by 3, exactly 3 etzba'ot by 3 etzba'ot is what our Mishnah is talking about, because when you light it, it diminishes the size. And then, since you have to hold the flame for a little while, you're touching something muktzeh. You're touching a broken vessel because it was 3 by 3 etzba'ot and now it's less. It's diminished. Okay, but now what are we going to do with that halacha? Now that we're saying, according to Rava, that this has nothing to do with an exactly 3 by 3 etzba'ot patch. This has nothing to do with the halacha that by lighting it you're diminishing it. So then what is where is that reference going to be applied? Where are we going to apply the reference of 3 by 3 etzba'ot metumtzamot, since we can't say that it applies to our Mishnah anymore? He says that is l'inyan tum'ah. That's with regard to tum'ah. That's not as we learned in the Mishnah. Gimel al gimel shamru chutz min malal divrei Rabbi Shimon v'chachamim omerim gimel al gimel mechuvanot. That basically the 3 by 3 precise etzba'ot is a reference to something else. What is it a reference to? It's a reference to a totally separate halacha. Not this halacha of candles on Shabbat, not this halacha of wicks. But what is it a reference to? It's a reference to a separate deal in the laws of Tumah v'Tahora. When the statement, in other words, Rav Yosef had this statement that he didn't know what to apply it to. He didn't know what it was relevant to. So he thought, I can apply it to our Mishnah. Our Mishnah must be talking about a case of exactly 3 by 3 etzba'ot. But now that we knocked that out, Rava is knocking out that interpretation. We're not talking about a wick that has the dimensions of 3 by 3 etzba'ot. We're not talking about Tumah v'Tahora. So what was that halacha relevant to then? The halacha was relevant to a different case, which is, let's say you have a patch of 3 by 3 etzba'ot, and what do you do with that patch? You fold a hem around the edge of the patch. By folding a hem around the edge of the patch, what do? You reduce the dimensions to less than 3 by 3 etzba'ot. So that was where Rav Yosef's teaching of 3 by 3 etzba'ot metumtzamot was, that's what it was speaking about. Because we see that there's a machloket between Rabbi Shimon and the Chachamim. Rabbi Shimon says that if you have a patch that's 3 by 3 etzba'ot, that has to be not including the hem. In other words, it's 3 by 3 etzba'ot and you fold it over into a hem, now it's no longer 3 by 3 etzba'ot, Rabbi Shimon says. Because actually you're going to have it smaller now. So he says it has to be 3 by 3 etzba'ot even after you fold over the hem. The Chachamim say no, even though you fold over that part, since the substance itself was 3 by 3 etzba'ot, it's still going to be
But it's not the same thing.
Subject to tum'ah.
It's not the same thing as folding because the hem, yes, it's folded, but it's also stitched.
Yeah, it's stitched.
So
but still, the point
is
that the quantity of material that you have there, in other words, the Chachamim are saying that the quantity of material you have there is really the same quantity of material that you would have in a 3 by 3 etzba'ot. Just that you stitched it in a different way.
The one who argues when you fold it, it's I mean, obviously it's the same quantity, but he's saying that when you fold it,
you stitch it.
No, but I mean, maybe that it's not the same when you stitch it and when you don't.
Right, but this is talking about stitching. In other words, this is separate.
So
according to this, we're leaving our Mishnah behind. We're not talking about our Mishnah anymore. Right. We're just trying to find a place to attach this halacha. We have this random floating halacha that 3 by 3 etzba'ot precisely. What does that mean? What's 3 by 3 etzba'ot precisely? Well, it can't be our Mishnah because we just said that it's not talking about that. So what are we going to do with this free-floating halacha? We have to attach it to something. We're going to attach it to a totally different case. The case of the machloket between Rabbi Shimon and the Chachamim, where the Chachamim said that if you fold over the hem, it doesn't matter. It's still considered a 3 by 3 etzba'ot cloth because the fact is that the quantity of material you have is still the same. But Rabbi Shimon says since you folded it over and you stitched it, we no longer look at it as a 3 by 3 etzba'ot entity, unless even after folding over the hem, it's still 3 by 3 etzba'ot in dimensions. So that's where the halacha was brought of 3 by 3 exact etzba'ot was a reference to this case that according to Rabbi Shimon, in other words, in support of Rabbi Shimon's halacha, that it has to be still exactly 3 by 3. So what does Rashi say? He says mitzum tzamot that the Chachamim are saying that it has to be 3 by 3 etzba'ot, and then he says v'hainu hach de Rav Yosef. This is what Rashi says. This is what Rav Yosef's halacha was. V'lav mishum di hava tefei lo mitamei ela la'apuke mit the Tanakama. That this is to exclude the Tanakama. This is to exclude the halacha that says that if you fold it over the hem and it's less than 3 by 3 etzba'ot, that it would still be good. That he's saying no, it has to be exactly 3 by 3 etzba'ot. That seems to be what Rashi is saying. Although one could interpret it the other way, that what Rav Yosef's halacha was saying was supporting the Chachamim and saying that even though it's folded over, it's still good. So exactly which side that halacha is supporting is not clear. Rashi seems to be applying it to Rabbi Shimon's view as a support for Rabbi Shimon's view. But it's also possible to learn it that it's supporting the Tanakama's view or the Chachamim's view. So now we move on. Amar Rav Yehuda says Amar Rav in the name of Rav. Mesikim b'kelim ve'en mesikim b'shivrei kelim. You can use kelim. You can use vessels. In other words, if you want to throw vessels into the fireplace on Yom Tov to utilize them, that's okay. But you can't use broken kelim. You can't use broken vessels on Yom Tov because they're muktzeh. Rabbi Yehuda says, Rabbi Shimon matir. Rabbi Shimon permits it. Masikin betmarin, you can use the pits of dates as firewood on Yom Tov. Achalan and masikin begarin. If you ate them, though, in other words, if you throw the whole dates in, it's okay. If you ate them, you can't throw the pits in. Why? Rabbi Yehuda, that's what Rabbi Yehuda says, because it's muktzeh. Because it changed its state. Before it was a date, now you ate the date, and all you have is the pit. The pit you can't use. Rabbi Shimon matir, and again Rabbi Shimon allows it. Masikin be'egozim achalan in masikin b'klipotehen. Rabbi Yehuda says you can throw nuts into the fire as firewood, but if you ate the nuts and now you have the shells, you can't use the shells. They're now muktzeh. Rabbi Shimon matir, and Rabbi Shimon allows it. Utzricha, and we need all three of these cases. Diyash ve'idan kamaita b'hagi kama Rabbi Yehuda mishum demeikara kli v'ashta shever kli. And you need all three cases. Why? Because if we only knew the case of a vessel, and we knew that Rabbi Yehuda said you can throw a vessel into the fire, but once the vessel breaks, you can't throw it into the fire anymore, it's muktzeh. That's because previously it had a status of kli. It had a status of vessel. Now it's a broken vessel. It changed status. And changing status is called nolad, a new entity. It's no longer the vessel it used to be. So therefore, it's not allowed to be handled. Aval tamarim, but dates, you might have thought, though, that dates were always dates. The pit was always inside there. It didn't change. It's just that now you ate the meat of the date, the flesh of the date, and now you have the pit. But it's always been there. So it's not really the same. So you might say that Rabbi Yehuda would permit. That's why he has to come along and say, no, even there, I don't permit. And maybe if I only told you the case of the dates, you would say that that's because Rabbi Yehuda is saying there's a change because the date pit was inside. It wasn't accessible. Now it is accessible. So there has been a change. But when it comes to nuts, that the shell was on the outside of the nut. So it was always accessible. You could always have taken it and used it as firewood. So you might think that would be permitted according to Rabbi Yehuda. Tzricha, that's why we need all three cases. In other words, we need to know that Rabbi Yehuda is so stringent about muktzeh that pretty much any change of state, whether it be a change from whole to broken, or it be a change that you remove the food and all you have is the pit, which doesn't have the same function as the food, or the shell. Once you remove the shell and it's no longer a part of the nut, it's like a new entity, and therefore it doesn't have a function anymore, and therefore it's muktzeh. So in all these cases, Rabbi Yehuda is stringent, and he says you can't handle these items. So if you're eating nuts, you have to put them. You have to throw the shells aside. You cannot utilize them for anything because you're not allowed to handle them once you've eaten them. It becomes muktzeh afterwards, in the process of eating.
Because you can't. I mean, if you're eating it, you have no choice.
Right.
So it becomes muktzeh afterwards.
Afterwards. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So v'hadar Rav Lav b'ferush Yidmar miklala Yidmar, and actually this statement of Rav that we said about what the position of Rabbi Yehuda is was not stated explicitly. We inferred it from something. Darav achal tamrei v'shada kashiata lebuchya. Because Rav was eating dates and he was throwing the pits into the fire. Amar le Rabbi Chia said to him, Bar Pachti, son of great people. In other words, important person. It's like people will say today, they'll call somebody by a nickname which shows their importance. Like, there are many such nicknames. Theirs was Bar Pachti. Kenegdo b'yom tov asur. Doing that on Yom Tov would be prohibited. In other words, because once you've eaten the date meat off of the date, you can't use the pits anymore. Kiblamine o lo kiblamine. That's true that you're saying that Rav, that we're inferring from this story what Rav held, but how do you know that Rav accepted it? Maybe Rav said back to Rabbi Chia, no, you're wrong. You can use date pits on Yom Tov. How do you know? Tashma, come in here. Rav because when Rav came to Bavel, Rav would eat the dates and throw the pits to the animals. He fed the animals. My love, befarsiata, velo kibala. Doesn't that mean that he was eating Persian dates? Persian dates were dates that were fully ripe. So when you would eat the flesh of the date, all that would be left was the pit. It would be clean. In other words, none of the flesh of the date would cling to the pit. So therefore, he had these pits that would be muktzeh. So, but he was throwing them to the animals, which means he didn't think that there was any problem in handling them. Lo ba'armiyata. No, he was eating the Armenian dates or the Aramean dates. The armiyata are the ones that since they have some of the flesh of the date still attached to them, they don't become muktzeh. So we can't determine whether Rav actually held of this opinion that you can't handle the totally clean pits or not, because it could be that he was handling only the pits that still had some date on them. Amar le Rab Shmuel bar Chana le Rav Yosef. Rab Shmuel bar Chana said to Rav Yosef, le Rabbi Yehuda, according to Rav Yehuda, that says that you can use whole vessels on Yom Tov as firewood, as fuel, but you can't use broken ones. But what about the fact that you're going to take let's say you take a whole vessel, you take a chair, you throw the chair in the fireplace. Isn't it going to break in there? It's going to break. And you're going to stoke the fire along the way. Right. So what difference does it make if you start out with broken vessels? You're going to have to handle the vessels. If you start out with whole vessels, they're obviously going to break in the fire, and then you're going to be stoking the fire. So what does Rabbi Yehuda say? Da'avad kid Rav Matana, because Rabbi Yehuda says it. What you have to do is like what Rav Matana said. Da'amar Rav Matana amar Rav etzim shnashru min hadekel latanur. That if you had trees that their branches fell off into the oven on Yom Tov, b'Yom Tov, marbe etzim muchanim masikan. You can still use the furnace on Yom Tov. Just put other etzim muchanim. In other words, the problem is on Yom Tov you can use firewood on Yom Tov because you're allowed to make fires, but you can't use muktzeh firewood. A branch that breaks off of a tree on Yom Tov is muktzeh. Why? Because it wasn't fit for use erev Yom Tov. It wasn't set aside for use on erev Yom Tov. In fact, it was prohibited for use in the beginning of Yom Tov because you're not allowed to break a branch off of a tree. So what happened here was that the branch broke off and fell into your fireplace. So what are you going to do? So he says, just put some permitted firewood, some firewood that you had from before Yom Tov, into the fire. And as long as the majority is non-muktzeh firewood, it's no problem. So to here, Rabbi Yehuda will say, you can use any vessel you want to fuel your fire. But you need to also put in firewood with it so that the majority of whatever you're stoking is not those vessels. Because once those vessels break inside the fireplace, they're no longer allowed to be directly handled. They are muktzeh. So you have to have that the majority is non-muktzeh firewood, even according to this. So Rav Hamnuna Amar Rav Hamnuna said, Now remember, we have two halachot in our Mishnah. The first halacha in the Mishnah was that Rabbi Akiva, because we talked about these wicks that were rolled, but they were not singed. So according to Rabbi Eliezer, what did we say? Time'ahi, it's subject to tum'ah, and ein madikinbo, you can't use it for lighting. And according to Rabbi Akiva, it is not subject to tum'ah, tehorahi, and madikinbo, and you can use it for lighting. Now we said, according to this interpretation that we're working with now, that Rava gave us, we said that these two halachot have nothing to do with each other. Because according to the first way, that it had to do with whether that wick was still considered a vessel when you light it or not. And according to Rabbi Akiva, we were saying that that it was considered that the rolling of the wick didn't diminish it. Diminished it already. And according to Rabbi Eliezer, it didn't diminish it already. So your lighting is actually what's going to diminish it. So there was actually a connection between the two halachot, because you weren't allowed to light this wick. What was the reason? Because by lighting it, you are disqualifying it from being a vessel, removing its impurity, and also removing its status of impurity, breaking it as a vessel, and therefore handling muktzeh and yom tov. So the two halachot were connected. Because since it was unsinged, therefore when you light it, you're actually diminishing its stature for the first time, according to Rabbi Eliezer, and that's a problem on Yom Tov. But now we're saying that no, the singeing of the wick has nothing to do with purity and impurity. The singeing of the wick is just a separate halacha, that you have to singe the wick, according to Rabbi Eliezer, before you light the Shabbat candles, and according to Rabbi Akiva, you don't. So what relevance does that have to purity and impurity? None. None, according to this, right? Because we're not concerned about the fact that you're breaking the vessel. We're not concerned about the fact that you're diminishing it. We're not concerned about the fact that we're not insisting that this has to be a Yom Tov on Friday. This could be any Friday. So then, what is the relevance of these two halachot? What's the explanation of the other halacha, that rolling this wick is whether it renders it, whether it's still capable of being mikabel tumah or not? So what is the explanation of their machloket, since we can't connect the two halachot in the Mishnah anymore? So what's the answer? So the Gemara says that here what we're talking about is here we're talking about a piece of cloth which is less than 3 by 3 tefachim. Forget about etzbaot. Tefachim. 3 by 3 hand breadths. So we're talking about a significant sized garment. And and what we're talking about here is rags that were treated lightly. Kulei matlaniot means rags that were treated lightly. What does that mean? It means that there are certain items that are by their very nature important items. For example, a suit. Let's say a person becomes rich and he has suits that he bought at Target. So he says, oh, this suit is trash. I'm going to throw it out now and buy suits at only the finest stores. The suit that he throws in the trash is still good. Nobody's going to say, oh, because he decided he doesn't want that suit anymore, now it's trash. On the other hand, a piece of a rag that's a scrap that anybody would throw in the trash is objectively trash. So there are certain things that are objectively valuable, and there are certain things that are objectively trash, and even if somebody decided to keep them, we would view them as objectively trash. So what about the middle ground? That's kulei matlaniot. There's a middle ground of things that maybe are not objectively and clearly valuable, but they're not objectively and clearly trash either. So what do we do with such things? So that's what we're talking about here. And there's a machloket in Masekhet Kelim, Rabbi Eliezer l'tameh, Rabbi Akiva l'tameh, and here they're following their respective opinions. The Tana, as we learned in the Mishnah, pachot mishlosha u'shlosha shetkinu lefakik bo hamerchatz ulena'er bo hakedera ulekaneach bo harechaim ben min hamukhan ben she'en min hamukhan tameh. The Rabbi Eliezer. So what does that mean? What it means is that you had a rag that was less than 3 by 3 tefachim. Again, if it's more than 3 by 3 hands breadths in length and width, then we're going to say that it's going to be objectively significant no matter what. But here we're talking about less than 3 by 3 tefachim, so it's up to you. This is the subjective range. Between 3 by 3 finger breadths and 3 by 3 hand breadths, it's up to you. If it's less than 3 by 3 finger breadths, we say it's not significant, it can't become tameh. If it's more than 3 by 3 hand breadths, it's intrinsically significant. What about in the middle? And you took this rag that was this middle category, neither objectively good nor objectively trash, and you plugged a leak in the bathhouse with it, or you cleaned your mill with it, or you used it as a to hold a hot pot. You made it one of those what do you call those mitts that you use for holding hot pots. You used it for something like that. So what? So the ben min hamuchan, ben she'en min hamuchan, whether it's something that was considered min hamuchan, we're going to see what this means in a second, or not min hamuchan, meaning whether it was something that you considered valuable for keeping or not. Okay, so this was something that potentially could be trash, and you used it for a use which would be considered that it's on its way out. In other words, it's no longer going to be used anymore. Because what would they use to plug a hole in the bathhouse? Not something they're planning on using again. What would what? Rags that are going to go in the trash, right? So here what happened is you used it to plug the bathhouse, or you used it to hold hot pots, and now you say, you know what? I'm going to keep it.
There's no number thing.
Right, yeah, they didn't have that. So now you say I'm going to keep it though. I decided I'm going to keep it. Right, so Rabbi Eliezer says that, you know what? It's tameh. It's tameh. Because you're going to keep it. You decided you're going to keep it.
Because it's useful.
Yeah.
Right.
And Rabbi Yehoshua says, ben menamuchan ben she'eno menamuchan tahor. And according to Rabbi Yehoshua, even if you decide to keep it, it's not subject to tumah anymore, because once you decided that you're going to use it for a lower type of use like this, it shows that you consider it trash. Rabbi Akiva says, that if it's something that you showed you want to keep, then it is going to be subject to tumah. If it's something you didn't show you want to keep, then it's going to be no longer subject to tumah. And now we're going to explain. And now we're going to explain exactly what they meant here. That Ra'ula said, and some say it was Rabbi Bar Chana said, that Rabbi Yochanan said as follows: Hakol modim zrakov ashba divrei kol tahor. Everyone agrees if you took this rag that you plugged up the merchatz, right? You plugged up the bathhouse leak, and then you took it and you threw it in the actual dumpster. Everybody agrees that's garbage. It's not subject to tumah anymore. Hinicho bekufsa. If you took it out of the place where you plugged it, the hole, and you put it back in the drawer to keep it, everybody agrees divrei kol tameh. We're not even talking about those cases. Everyone agrees that even though you used this rag, which is between the dimensions of 3 by 3 finger breadths and 3 by 3 tefachim, it's in between, it's in the gray area. You used it for a lower, let's say a repulsive sort of use, a use that would normally be reserved for trash. If you decided to keep it by putting it back in the drawer, it's definitely still valuable to you. It's valuable to you. So nobody's arguing about that. So what are we arguing about that? Lo nechleku ela shetila oba magod o shenichol achorei adelet. That you either hung it from a pole in the wall, you have like a rack, you hung it, or you threw it behind the door. So this is what we're talking about. So when we said muchan, when they said muchan, that it's something you decided to keep, that means you hung it on the wall. So you didn't put it back in a drawer to actually keep it safe, but you hung it on the wall, so you didn't throw it in the trash. Or when it said shalom min hamuchan, that it wasn't something you showed you wanted to keep, you threw it behind the door. So you didn't throw it in the trash, but you didn't exactly put it in a nice place.
To go to the trash.
Right, yeah. Right, it's eino min hamuchan is being used as the term that it's not, that you didn't throw it in the trash, but you didn't put it in a mechubad place. You didn't dispose of it, but you didn't keep it in a nice place. You put it behind the door. Okay, so what's the machloket? So Rabbi Eliezer savar mitlo zrako bashba date ilave. Rabbi Eliezer says, as long as you didn't throw that in the dumpster, it's still good. So why does he use the term lo min hamuchan? Because anything less than a drawer is not muchan. In other words, what Rabbi Eliezer said when he said whether you took something that you preserved or you didn't preserve, whether you preserved it or you didn't preserve it, it's still subject to tumah. What he means is, even though what you did with it is less than putting it in a drawer, it doesn't matter. Unless you actually throw it in the garbage can, it's still something that you're using. And Rabbi Yehoshua savar midlom hinicho b'kufsa bitulei batilei, that Rabbi Yehoshua says once you've used it for a lower kind of a use that's generally for trash, like plugging a leak, so that automatically we assume it's not going to be subject to tumah anymore unless you put it back in the drawer. And anything, and why does he say? So in other words, everybody agrees that if you put it in the drawer, it's going to become subject to tumah again because you're restoring it to its original value. You're saying it's valuable. So then why does Rabbi Yehoshua say even if it's muchan, even if you're keeping it, it's not considered to be, it's not going to be subject to Tumah anymore. Why does he say even if you're going to keep it? He didn't mean even if you put it in the drawer, because if you put it in the drawer, everybody agrees it is for keeping. What he meant was even though you hung it on the wall, even though you put it behind the door, you didn't throw it in the trash, still it's not going to be considered tameh. You don't have to throw it in the trash for it to be considered rejected. It's automatically considered rejected unless you put it back in the drawer, according to Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi Akiva says, "Bitlo b'magod savar ka Rabbi Eliezer b'nichoach re'adelet savar like Rabbi Yoshua." That basically Rabbi Akiva says a middle position. If you hung it on the door, I agree with Rabbi Eliezer. In other words, I agree with Rabbi Eliezer that if you hung it on the door, if you hung it on the wall rather, that's enough to show you didn't leave it on the floor. You hung it on the door. You hung it up. That's enough to show that you want to keep it. And therefore, it's going to be subject to tumah. But if you threw it behind the door, on the floor behind the door, that's basically like throwing it in the garbage.
Why is subject to tumah if you put behind the door?
He's saying, well, that's the machloket. In other words, according to Rabbi Yoshua, according to Rabbi Eliezer,
Where the tumah is coming?
subject to tumah. That means that, in other words, if an item, let's say you had this item, when we say subject to tumah, we don't say it automatically becomes tameh. It means whether it even could be tameh. Something to be tameh has to be a valuable object. So if it's not valuable, it can't be. Oh, let's say a dead mouse falls on it. I don't know. Anyway.
Susceptible to
And a mouse dies on it. Who knows? Could be. The point is that once this is considered trash, it's even if it touches a dead body, even if it touches anything that's tameh, it wouldn't become tameh because it's not a valuable object anymore. It's considered a nothing. It's not even capable. It has to have a certain level of sophistication to even be able to be mekabel tumah, to even be able to come tameh. So what we have is three positions. According to Rabbi Eliezer, anything short of throwing it in the trash, it's still considered keeping it. And if you're keeping it, it's valuable. And if it's valuable, it can be tameh. Rabbi Yoshua says anything short of putting it in the drawer is rejecting it. If you put it behind the door, you put it on the wall, you rejected it, and therefore, unless you put it in the drawer, it can never become tameh again because you've shown that you rejected it by using it for an undignified purpose like plugging a hole. Rabbi Akiva says, I'll make a compromise. If you hung it on the wall, that's like putting it in the drawer. That's like keeping it because you're hanging it up. If you threw it behind the door, that's like throwing it in the garbage. It just didn't make it all the way out to the trash yet. So therefore you rejected it, and by rejecting it, you are robbing it of its status as a vessel, and by robbing it of its status as a significant vessel, you are saying that even if it touches something tameh, it will not become tameh. That is the position of Rabbi Akiva. So what do we do now? So now the relevance, obviously, to our Mishnah is that it must be talking then about a case. So what was the relevance of this discussion? That Rabbi Eliezer is saying in our Mishnah that if you rolled a petilah, if you rolled this garment and you didn't singe it, it's tameh. It's talking, according to Rabbi Eliezer, about this case where you had this rag that was used, let's say, to plug a hole or to do something else with it, and you decided to roll it into a wick. After using it for one of these purposes, you rolled it into a wick.
Because they all agreed that they rejected the 3x3 tefachim. That was.
It's less than 3x3 tefachim.
Right.
Because if it were more than 3x3 tefachim, even if you wanted to throw it in the garbage, it would still be good.
Right. So that they rejected that, so it couldn't not have been the 3x3.
It must have been between 3x3 etzbaot and 3x3 tefachim.
Oh, etzbaot. Right.
In that category, in that window. Right.
They rejected the etzbaot. Right.
So it's in between those two.
Right.
Right. So what Rabbi Eliezer says is, since you rolled it back in to become a wick, so you used it for garbage, but you rolled it back in to become a wick, he said that shows you're keeping it. You're keeping it. Right. But Rabbi Akiva in the Mishnah is saying no, that once you used it for a bad purpose, since you haven't put it back in the drawer for safekeeping, but you just rolled it to become a wick, that's not enough to show that you want to restore it to its original state, and that's why it's tahor, according to Rabbi Akiva. That's the explanation of our Mishnah. Our Mishnah is talking about a wick that was rolled from one of these rejected rags. And the question is rolling it into a wick, reinstating it to be valuable again or not? Rabbi Eliezer says yes, Rabbi Akiva says no. It doesn't have to be. So these are just two separate halachot. In other words, if that wick comes into contact with something tameh, will it become tameh? It's a separate question. It doesn't have to be. That's a separate question. It doesn't have to be tahor. No, it's a totally separate question. Yeah. So what happens now? And actually, in the end, Rabbi Akiva retracted and agreed with Rabbi Yehoshua. Mimai, how do we know that? Amar Rav Hami de Katane Petilata Beged. Because in the Mishnah it says Petilata Beged. In other words, he came back to agree with Rabbi Yehoshua that anything less than putting it in the drawer is rejecting it. Right? That's in other words, in all cases, even if you hung it on the wall, in the end, Rabbi Akiva said you reject it. And where do we get that from? Because what does it say in the Mishnah? Petilata Beged. It says the wick of the beged. My irya detani petilat ha-beged. Why does he say petilat ha-beged? Okay, he doesn't say litne petilat shel beged. He should say a wick made from a garment. By saying a wick of a garment, he's saying that it's a garment, but you rolled it into a wick. Yeah. So my petilat ha-beged adain beged. In other words, what Rabbi Akiva was saying, that even though according to Rabbi Eliezer, it's still a beged. In other words, even though you hung it on the wall, so in some respect you might say it's still a beged, it's still valuable. Still, I'm going to say that since you didn't put it back in the drawer, it didn't regain its ability to be mekabel tuma. So now we move on to the next Mishnah. You cannot do the following. Now what you would have here is a dish. You have a dish that you have a wick in the dish, and you suspend above the dish an eggshell. You make a hole in the bottom of an eggshell, you put oil in it, and the oil will drip bit by bit into the kli below. And that way, the wick is burning in the kli below, in the vessel below. But the oil is held above it and is dripping down into the vessel below. Okay? Maybe it would burn longer, maybe it preserves oil, because that way, instead of just dumping a whole bunch into the dish, it drips bit by bit, and maybe it'll save more. Who knows? But you're not allowed to do it. Even if instead of an eggshell you use an earthenware container with a hole in the bottom, you still can't do it because the piece, right? Shabbat. You can't have the oil being held in one place and the wick in another place. That's the basic rule. Rabbi Yehuda is going to allow you to do it. However, if they were fashioned that way, in other words, if you bought you went to one of these antique stores and you bought one of these creative candles that's made that way, that it has a vessel on top that holds the oil and it drips down, and that's how it's created. You didn't make a makeshift setup; it was built that way. Yeah, it was constructed that way. Right. In other words, it's one piece. It's a piece that's constructed like that, not that you made a makeshift arrangement. So then you could use it because it's one entity. For Rabbi Yehuda Matir, this is the similar concept, but here instead of one suspended over the other, you have a plate of oil over here, or a bowl of oil. You put the wick over here. You light the wick here. The oil is in one plate. The wick is being held in another place. Okay, so you don't want. So again, it's the same concept that the oil and the wick are separated from one another. Although here the wick is stretched from one to the other. So you have the wick actually in the oil, but the oil is somewhere else and the flame is somewhere else. Utzricha, and you need all these cases. The Gemara says, because if we only had the case of the shoferet shel beitzah, that you had of the eggshell being suspended above the candle. What's the problem in all these cases, by the way? The problem is that by having the oil in a separate container, it's separate from the fire, you may come to take from that oil on Shabbat because you don't see the flame right there. So you might say, what am I doing? I'm not touching the candle on Shabbat. I'm just taking the oil. Everyone knows you can't touch a candle on Shabbat. But maybe since the oil is separate, you're going to take from the oil because you say, hey, what am I doing wrong? The problem is that's mechabeh because you're facilitating, you're aiding and abetting the extinguishing of the candle by reducing the amount of fuel. You're not allowed to do that. But it's not going to be apparent to you that you're doing that because the oil's in a different location than the fire. So if we had the case of the eggshell, you might say, I understand why with an eggshell you can't do it because since an eggshell is clean, it's not ma'us. Okay, it's not something which is disgusting. You might take the oil out. Aval shel cheres demeisa ema module Rabbi Yehuda. You might think that if you used a kli cheres, if you used an earthenware vessel to hold the oil, which could become dirty or could be it was less clean, it would ruin the oil because they didn't have the kind of earthenware we have today, which is a very fine processed thing. Their earthenware was clay, basically. And so the oil would become disgusting by being in a clay holder. And so you might not be tempted to take oil from it because it's in a clay holder anyway. So you might have thought that the rabbis would allow you to use a clay holder or an earthenware holder because nobody's going to want that oil once it's been in the earthenware holder because it's going to be dirty. Because you have to imagine, clayware or earthenware that's not glazed like what we have.
Like terracotta.
Right, yeah, something and not very well refined because we're talking about the old days. But still they don't allow it. V'iyashma inan shel cheres, and if they only told us the case of cheres, of an earthenware cup, b'hakam Rabbi Yehuda v'hahi ema model ul Rabbanan, you would have the opposite problem, that if we only had the case of the kli cheres, of the earthenware version, you might have thought that Rabbi Yehuda allows only the earthenware version, because there we know that you won't take oil from it, because it's disgusting. But maybe he would agree with the rabbis in a case of an eggshell that you might take oil from it, and therefore he wouldn't allow you to use that setup. If you had the two cases in the beginning. Now, so why do you need the third case? Why do you need the case where the plate of oil is over here and the wick is over, and the wick extends over here and the flame is here and the plate is over here? We already have the one where the oil is suspended over the flame. What's the difference side by side? He says because you might say like this, that with the case of the candle, that there's no real interruption. In other words, even though the oil is over the candle, the eggshell is suspended over the candle, still it's all in one place. It's all in one place. So you're going to see that it's feeding a candle. But with the wick that stretches from a plate of oil to somewhere else, maybe you won't even see the plate of oil where it is. It could be in another room, for God's sake. We don't know. So therefore, you might think that Rabbi Yehuda will agree that you can't use a setup like that because you don't see the oil in the wick. They're not like in the same place. And yet he still permits. And on the other flip side, v'ashma inan behahi, and if we had only that case, behahi k'amri rabbanan aval b'hanei tartei ema modulu l'Rabbi Yehuda tzricha. Same thing, that if we only had the last case, where the plate of oil is in one place and the wick is in another place, and they're not necessarily in close proximity to one another, you might have thought that's where the rabbis prohibit. Because there, we don't necessarily see the flame when we see the oil. But in the case of the suspending of the eggshell over the candle, there maybe the rabbis would be lenient, because they would say, you know what, you're going to see that this is feeding a candle. You're not going to take from it. That's why we need all three cases, to see that the rabbis are stringent in all three circumstances, whether or not it's likely that you're going to take the oil. And Rabbi Yehuda is lenient even in the cases where there's more of a chance that you might take the oil. He doesn't subscribe to this gezerat, to this decree. Now we said that if the fashioner fashioned it that way, if he attached it, in other words, if the potter, the yotzer, created the candle from the beginning, that it has its oil receptacle on top and it drips down to the bottom. He's some kind of artiste, he's one of these guys who makes this fancy, creative, ideas. He's an innovative guy. So, Tana, it says in a Tosefta, mutar. That it says in the Tosefta that even if it doesn't say that the person who fashioned it had to have designed it that way. It says that even if you come along and with clay or with lime, you attach the cup to the candle, so you suspend it, you create it that way. You didn't just hang the eggshell over the candle, but you actually crafted it into something in your garage.
The relevant part is basically you make it obvious that
it's one entity.
That is one entity,
right.
And therefore you're not likely to
take from it. Exactly.
Because you see that it's not meant for it.
Right, va'anan tanan, but we said va'anan yotzer tanan, but our Mishnah said the yotzer, that the original construction had to be like that. That the yotzer, the person who made the candle, had to have done it. And now you're saying that you can do it. So the answer is, my yotzer ke'en yotzer. All it means is that you have to do it in a way that's as stable and as durable as the way that the person who originally would have made it would make it. Not that you have to necessarily be the one who originally made it, or that it originally had to be that way. Just that you had to have fixed it in a way that's as stable as if it were fashioned that way. Tanya, it says, Nabraita Amar Rabbi Yehuda says, Pam achat Shabbatenu ba'aliyat Bet Nitzah. Once we spent Shabbat in the upper area of Bet Nitzah, Belod, in Lod, or it means in the attic of Bet Nitzah. And veheviu lanu shifoferet shel betza, and they brought umilanua shemen, and he says that they brought us an eggshell. We filled it with oil. V'nikavnua, and we made a hole in the bottom. V'hinachnua al pianer, and we suspended it over the candle. Vayasham Rabbi Tarfon. Rabbi Tarfon was there. Uzkenim, the elders were there. V'lo amru lanu davar. In other words, Rabbi Yehuda is saying, I have proof with my own eyes that you're allowed to do this, because Rabbi Yehuda is the one that says it's permitted in the Mishnah. He said Rabbi Tarfon was there. The elders were there. We did it. What do you mean you're not allowed to do it? Amru lo, they said to him, Gisham Raya. You're bringing a proof from there. Shani Beit Nitzad is Rizinhen. That Gezerah didn't apply to the people there. They were all very, very careful and meticulous, and therefore we weren't worried. But the average person can't be relied upon like that. Avin av Tzipora, Garar Safsala, Bilita, Deshesha, Le'ela Rabbi Yitzchak ben Elazar. He dragged a bench in a place that had a marble floor, basically, in front of Rabbi Yitzchak ben Elazar. Now we know that dragging a bench on Shabbat when it's outside can be a problem because you make a hole in the ground. But it's a machloket between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Shimon says you're allowed to drag it as long as your intention is not to make a hole in the ground, because that's called davar sheino mitkaven. It's not intended, and it's not inevitable that it'll make a hole in the ground. And since it's not inevitable and it's not intended, it's okay. And Rabbi Yehuda said you cannot drag a bench across the ground, because even though it's not inevitable and even though it's not intentional, you shouldn't do it. So what happened? So Avin Tzipora drags a bench in the attic, in the upper floor of a house that had a marble floor in front of Rabbi Yitzchak ben Elazar. So he figured, hey, it has a marble floor. I can't make a hole in a marble floor by dragging a bench, that's for sure. Amar le, he said, if I don't say anything to you, just like the colleagues of Rabbi Yehuda didn't say anything to him about the eggshell case, there's going to be destruction from this. In other words, what happened in Rabbi Yehuda's case where they suspended the eggshell over the candle, nobody said anything, and so Rabbi Yehuda reported this as the halacha. If I don't say anything to you about dragging a bench, you're going to report the halacha is that you're allowed to drag a bench. So therefore, what did he say? Gezerah, ilita de shesha, atu ilita de alma. That a floor of marble you can't drag a bench on because you might end up dragging a bench somewhere else where the floor is not made of marble, and therefore, I can't allow you to do it even here. In other words, we don't make a distinction between a place which has a marble floor or doesn't have a marble floor. We don't allow it anywhere.
So is he trying to refute?
He's telling him, don't do it.
He's trying to refute the argument that they didn't do it because they were all, Talmidei Chachamim.
Well, he's saying that Rabbi Yehuda made a mistake because he said, since they didn't say anything like, don't do that, he went out and told everyone the halacha was that you're allowed to put an eggshell like that. So he's saying, if I look the other way and say, you're not going to, the difference, right, so you're dragging a marble, so it's no problem. If I don't say anything, you're going to go out and say, look, he said you can drag on marble floors. And then everyone will drag on marble floors. And if everyone drags on marble floors, everyone's going to drag on the dirt, and it's going to be a problem. So what happens? So therefore he protested. Resh Kinishta de Botzra. The head of the community of Botzra, Garar Safsala Rabbi Yirmiyah Rabbah, he dragged a bench in front of Rabbi Yirmiyah Rabbah. And this could have been even on a dirt floor. Amarle, he said to him, Kiman, Rabbi Shimon, you're following Rabbi Shimon who says you're allowed to drag a bench on the dirt, even on the dirt. But wait a second. Emar damar Rabbi Shimon bigdolim, delo efshar, b'ktanim yamar. Rabbi Shimon only allowed that in a case of large benches that are not able to be lifted. Since you don't have a choice, you can only drag them, you're allowed to drag them, since you don't intend to make a hole in the ground. But a small chair that you could pick up easily, why do you have to drag it? In other words, according to Rabbi Yirmiyah Rabbah, the argument between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon is only in a case of large benches. That's Rabbi Shimon says, since you don't intend to make a hole in the ground, you can drag a large bench since you don't have another choice. And Rabbi Yehuda says, even though you don't have a choice, you should drag it. You can't drag it. But with a small vessel, everyone agrees you should carry it, because why should you create a situation where you might make a hole in the ground? Upliga de Ula. This is the opposite of what Ula said. Tamar Ula said, Machloket biktanim. Actually, the machloket was with small vessels, that according to Rabbi Shimon, you can drag a small bench across the ground, and according to Rabbi Yehuda, you can't. Aval bigdolim divrei kol mutar. But according to Rabbi Yehuda, you can drag a large vessel because you have no choice. In other words, according to Rabbi Yirmiyah, So you have it's like a reverse machloket. So according to Rabbi Yirmiyah, what you have here is that Rabbi Shimon agrees that, in other words, in all cases, you really shouldn't drag a bench unless you have to. And when you have to, Rabbi Shimon allows, and Rabbi Yehuda doesn't allow. So basically, Rabbi Yehuda never allows you to drag a bench, and Rabbi Shimon only allows you to do it when it's too large to carry. According to Ula, it's the opposite. Everyone agrees if it's too large to carry, you're allowed to drag it. The only machloket is when it's small and you could avoid dragging it. That's where Rabbi Yehuda says you can't drag it, and Rabbi Shimon says you can drag it. Okay, so you have reverse positions here. So what do we make of this? So, Mativ, Rav Yosef raised an objection. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says, Gorer Adam mitav kiseh v'safsal u'v'lo shel yitkaven la'asot charitz. That in the case, Rabbi Shimon says you can drag a bed, which is large, obviously, kiseh, a chair, and a safsal, a bench. He says three things. As long as you don't intend to make a hole. Katani gidolim v'katani ktanim. This has both small and large furniture. And yet Rabbi Shimon is allowing all of it. So that's a problem for everyone. Kashel tarvayu. This is a problem for everybody. Because according to everybody, there's at least one case where a person shouldn't, where it should be different. In other words, according to Rabbi Yirmiyah, you should have to pick up the small items. You shouldn't be able to drag them, according to Rabbi Shimon. Because according to Rabbi Yirmiyah, Rabbi Shimon only allows you to drag large things. And according to Ula, we see that Rabbi Yehuda, who argues with Rabbi Shimon, is prohibiting even the large items to be dragged. Because that's the case there. So Ula mitaretz l'tamei, Rabbi Yirmiyah Rabba mitaretz l'tamei. So Ula answers according to his version, and Rabbi Yirmiyah will answer according to his version. So Ula mitaretz l'tamei mitadum yad dekiseh. That what is it talking about in that case? It's talking about a small bed, and that's why Rabbi Yehuda prohibits. Rabbi Yirmiyah Rabba mitaretz l'tamei kiseh dum yad demita. That according to Rabbi Yirmiyah, when did Rabbi Shimon allow you to carry it? Allow you to drag it only when it was large and you didn't have any other choice. Okay, so Mativ Rabba raised an objection. Mochrei kesut mochrin kedar kan mevad shlo yikaven b'chama b'pnei chama u'b'gshamim b'pnei geshamim. That if you are a clothing seller and you are selling shatnez clothing to non-Jews, so you're allowed to model the clothing for the non-Jews. You can put it on yourself, even though it's shatnez. Why? Because you don't intend to cover yourself from the rain or the cold, and you don't intend to cover yourself from the sun. In other words, it's unintentional. Whatever benefit you gain from putting on this garment is not intentional. You're just doing it for commercial purposes. So wait a second. But then it says vatzunuin, and those who are very particular, mafshilin b'makel achorehen, they would hang the garments up rather than model them on their own bodies because they didn't want to put the shatnez on their bodies. Okay, but what's the point here? That v'hachad efshar b'leme'ebad kitznuin deki katane damei v'chilo mitkaven sharei Rabbi Shimon lechatchila. But wait a second. This case is just like the case of small chairs. Why? Because just like a small chair, you can pick up and move it. You don't have to drag it. And Rabbi Yirmiyah said if you don't have to drag it, you shouldn't, even according to Rabbi Shimon. But here we have always the option of hanging the clothing up on a stick or hanging it on a mannequin or something like that. You don't have to model the clothing. And yet Rabbi Shimon says if you don't intend to benefit from the clothing, it's okay to model it yourself, even though you have an alternative that wouldn't involve wearing it, and yet he allows it. So, tiyuvta, Rabbi Yirmiyah Rabba, tiyuvta, this is a clear refutation of Rabbi Yirmiyah, that when Rabbi Shimon says, Rabbi Yirmiyah wanted to say that when does Rabbi Shimon allow you to do something which is davar she'eino mitkaven, where you don't intend to violate a prohibition? You can do that action. In other words, you're risking the violation of a prohibition that you don't intend. So Rabbi Yirmiyah says you should only risk it when you have to. Why should you risk it when you don't have to? In other words, why should you even do the activity when you don't have to? If it's a small vessel, pick it up. That's what Rabbi Yirmiyah had said. Rabbi Yirmiyah Rabbah had said. So now, but we see that in the case of shatnez, even though you have an alternative, and hanging the clothing that's shatnez on a mannequin is similar to picking up the chair that's small. In other words, you have a recourse where you don't have to risk violating a prohibition at all. You don't have to get involved with it at all. And yet, Rabbi Shimon is saying that you're allowed to model the clothing on your own body, even though you have an alternative. So you see that even where there's an alternative, we say that davar she'eino mitkaven is allowed. You're allowed to do this action and risk violating the prohibition, so to speak, as long as you don't have the intent to violate it. Even though you have an alternative way of accomplishing your goal that wouldn't risk it at all. So this is exactly the same as picking up a chair. You can drag the chair, and Rabbi Shimon would say it's okay if it's a heavy chair. Rabbi Yirmiyah said, yeah, but if it's a small chair, you can pick it up and move it. Why do you have to drag it? Why do you have to get involved at all? So, but you see that that's not a factor. Once we say davar she'eino mitkaven is allowed, once we say that dragging the chair is allowed, even where you could have picked it up and carried it, you're allowed to drag it. Even when you had an alternative, you're allowed to drag it. And that's a refutation of Rabbi Yirmiyah Rabbah. And we say that even for small furniture, dragging is allowed, according to Rabbi Shimon, since you don't intend to make a
and therefore
pit. How do you
with the